Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy.
Here, how ought we understand the way in which the Dharma is presented in the sutras? The lists and matrices of the teaching are very dry, even if they are straightforward and clear. And in the more enjoyable stories, the teaching is difficult to parse out, even if the plot is more delightful and exciting.
The Buddha's presentation of the teaching is extremely varied, though it is all the true Dharma. The lists and matrices are clear and straightforward, but they do not delight. The stories are delightful and inspiring, but the teaching they conceal is subtle and refined. However, if we view it all as containing something from which we can learn and improve, I think we're understanding it correctly.
I suppose it is the same with life. There are boring moments, happy moments, sad moments, angry moments, but they are all moments from which we can understand something about the world, about the life we live, and about the way we ought to navigate it all.
Right you are, Hermit. If we cultivate the eyes of a learner even when we are not being taught to directly by the Buddha, we can learn everything he has to teach us, and we can become better than we were before.
Hello, and welcome to Bright on Buddhism. This week we will be discussing upaya, or skillful means. What is upaya? What are the different meanings of this word? How do they change over time? We hope you enjoy. So, what is upaya?
Upaya is a Sanskrit word that translates into English as skillful means or expedient means. This concept is ubiquitous in Buddhist doctrine, and it serves many purposes, and it also has a very complex definition. The basis of this doctrine is an idea that we have seen many times before. Namely, it's based on the idea that it's impossible to explain enlightenment using words in a very normal and typical fashion. Enlightenment is an experience of non-duality. It's an experience of insight into the non-arising of all dharmas, an experience of wisdom, of non-self. And words are dualistic, they're vulgar, and they're insufficient, and so they really can't be used in most cases to communicate this experience. Therefore, the Buddha is presented with a problem. He has tasted chocolate, and nobody in his audience has tasted chocolate, or they have and they've forgotten the taste of chocolate, or they have and they don't know that they have, and he has to find some way to explain it to them. He has to find some way to remind them, and he has to find some way to teach them effectively to lead them to where he is. Upaya is how he does that. Through the use of language and actions in a very delightful and educational way, he can lead people to enlightenment. Here we reach the definition of upaya. Through his use of language and his actions, which are by definition wise, delightful, and unique, he can push people in the right direction and create the causes and conditions for them to have the experience of non-duality and non-arising of all dharmas themselves. Skillful language encourages people to meditate, to consider, to do good acts, etc. It also delights and gladdens them. Because it creates the causes and conditions for these wholesome and positive acts, it is considered a form of merit transfer. Remember, the definition of merit transfer was doing something that was karmically good, like recitation of a sutra or preaching the Dharma, and that creates the conditions for others to do something karmically good, such as hear the Dharma, be encouraged, etc. The Buddha's words and actions transfer merit in this way. There are a few things that should be noted here, though. One is that an alternative translation of upaya is expedient means, rather than just skillful means. This is because in the Buddhist tradition, the Buddha's actions and words, and the Dharma as well, carry more meaning and more teachings second by second than one could ever put into words, even given a measurable time. So because of that, it's thought to be more expedient than direct speech in enlightening sentient beings. Another point to note is that one has to be enlightened to use skillful means. It requires that the teacher be omniscient, and they need to know the mind, the karma, and the fate of the person or persons that they're teaching to. Upaya is the Buddha's ability to say the exact right thing at the exact right time to the exact right person, and have that be just the thing they needed to hear to move forward on the path of enlightenment. He can teach to spiritually underdeveloped people, and be just as effective as if he were teaching to extremely spiritually developed people.
What are the different meanings of upaya?
There are two dimensions that we can approach upaya from. One is behavioral and one is dogmatic with regards to Buddhist doctrine. Before we come at it from those dimensions, however, let's consider it just a little bit more. Remember from the previous question that upaya does not exclusively refer to language. You will see in many sutras that they begin with trippy stuff happening, right? In the beginning of the Lotus Sutra, for example, the Buddha shoots lights from between his eyes that allows you to see all the Buddha realms in all the 10 directions, and it casts a sky of umbrellas above the audience. In the Vimalakirti Sutra, Vimalakirti creates a palace with super tall thrones and tons of surface area inside of his little hut, which is only 100 square feet. This kind of thing is another form of skillful means. When words fail, actions can also be effective as communication, and the Buddha regularly used actions like that to teach and to delight sentient beings. Therefore, actions are also a form of skillful means. From the behavioral perspective, there are examples of what one should do and what one should not do. The Buddha demonstrated renunciation, awakening, defeat of desire, defeat of suffering, etc., to show people how and why they should do it like he did. However, demonstrations of what one should not do can be as effective of teaching tools as demonstrations of what one should do. The Buddha's life story itself is encouraging, delightful, and inspiring to people, but it has been argued that those who arise in the world to slander the Dharma, to preach the false Dharma, to do evil acts, and to be evil people, etc., are also arising in the world as a means of teaching people what happens when they do wrong, and why they shouldn't do wrong. What is happening in this case is that these people are already enlightened because they're using skillful means. However, they're doing evil things as their skillful means and as their means of teaching people rather than being good, rather than showing by example what one should do. What's interesting about this is that it assumes that everybody, whether or not they're teaching you by example of good or by example of bad, is a Buddha. Or else they would not be able to use skillful means. But remember, you can forget your enlightenment also. You can forget your past Buddhahood. And anybody can be a secret or hidden Buddha who does not even know they are a Buddha. This is all the more reason in Buddhism to treat people with respect and be good to them as much as possible, even if they are bad, because they could be a secret or hidden Buddha. This is where we come to the dogmatic doctrinal perspective. Skillful means opens you up to doing a lot of bad things and to saying bad things about the Dharma or preaching outside the Dharma, if it is all done with the purpose of teaching and enlightening people according to that very Dharma. The idea is that maybe people are not ready to hear or understand a Dharma teaching, so you have to get to their level and figuratively speak their language. Remember that skillful means is the Buddha's ability to say the exact right thing at the exact right time to the exact right person to make them be better people. That can mean saying something that's contrary to a certain doctrine or doing something that is morally wrong, but at least makes the person advance spiritually in some way. The whole thing questions morality in some fascinating ways. This can actually be seen in the Vimalakirti Sutra, which we will read and discuss soon. Vimalakirti, the main character, is allegedly more advanced in the teaching than all the 10 of the Buddha's disciples, and yet he's like a playboy. He's rich, he hangs out with prostitutes and gamblers, he does all kinds of things that are counter to renunciation and morality and asceticism, and yet he ends up preaching the Bodhisattva path to the Buddha's disciples. With this main point being the Bodhisattva's work of alleviating suffering and saving sentient beings is really more or less wasted in the monastery and is more effective by going where the suffering is the most and the highest, these dens of iniquity, you might say, and saving the people there who need it the most.
So this clarifies the idea of original Buddhahood a bit for me. As we originally came to that idea, I was trying to think of what good that idea brings out from a doctrinal perspective, and this makes it make a lot more sense. The idea that you can forget this original Buddhahood means that technically you can be practicing upaya even if you don't know it at this point. It looks like, based on these definitions, that the hidden bodhisattva or the hidden Buddha is hidden from themselves as well. Like, they don't know it either.
Yes, and that's all entirely due to their own karmic history, which is now also getting extremely more complicated. If they don't have sufficient karma to remember their own Buddhahood, but they are Buddhas and they are acting in the world for teaching purposes and making use of upaya, then are the bad things they're doing karmically good or karmically bad? This is a very, very interesting question. If someone were to be a hidden Buddha and arise in the world and kill as a skillful means, is that good for them or is that bad for them? That question is very open-ended because it puts you in a double bind. They are already acting karmically, but somehow they have fallen back into acting karmically, and their purposes, though they do not know their purpose, is to teach. And in fact, what they know their purpose to be is to do evil. And how does that factor in for them morally? It's really confusing sometimes. And it speaks to the fact that karma cannot strictly be understood in like a dualistic, all good, all bad type of way, even though it makes it kind of easier to understand it that way. It's still not a complete picture. And these hidden Buddhas, these hidden bodhisattvas are a very good example of why. We can't really know, unless we ourselves are omniscient, if a hidden Buddha who arises in the world to do evil is actually accruing bad karma or good karma. And we can't know what the implications of that are for everybody else, whether they are or are not hidden Buddhas and bodhisattvas. Of course, the other question then also is everybody really a hidden Buddha or bodhisattva, or are just some people? That makes it even more complicated to diagnose whether something somebody does is good or bad. And because of this kind of doctrine, that's why we have like these huge moralistic debates that erupt in Mahayana, because they can't really wrap their heads around it, especially if only a few people are Buddhas and bodhisattvas, and especially if we can't know if those hidden Buddhas who do bad things are actually accruing good or bad karma. It gets really hard to know if anything that we do is karmically good or karmically bad. And this crisis spurns a lot of reforms in Mahayana Buddhism that seek to rectify the issue.
All right, let's get back to the script, I think. So, how do the meanings of upaya change over time?
So there are a few trajectories that we can trace with this word. The first is the fact that it was at first nothing more than the Buddha's skillful and delightful words to teach and to enlighten and to delight. And then it became maximized to include everything, everywhere, all the time. If we were to discuss that question a little deeper, let's ask this question. If indeed actions are a skillful means, then it begs the question where the line is. The Lotus Sutra asks this very question. It takes the concept of skillful means to its logical and even illogical limits, and poses the argument that the Buddha's arising in the world, being born as a prince, seeing aging, illness, and death, leaving the palace, sitting under the tree, preaching the Dharma, and dying, was all a skillful means. It was all a demonstration. It was all a presentation. And he did it all on purpose, for the purpose of enlightening and encouraging people. So this begs the question, though, if the Buddha has the ability to do such a thing, why would he do that? Why would he make that specific choice? Of course, we've talked about how it's like showing somebody something instead of explaining it to them, but why would you actually go through all the mess of being born in samsara and then procedurally, demonstrably leaving it for these skillful means? Well, it's because the story is very actually encouraging and very inspiring, and it's one of the most frequently told stories in all of the religious world. Also, as we've mentioned, this question of why you would show somebody something instead of explaining it to them also works in the inverse, as we've mentioned with bad people. Are bad people also teaching through their actions? The Lotus Sutra can sometimes say yes, sometimes no, since we brought up that example, but it gets complicated. However, this question of the limit or the line of skillful means can go even further than someone's entire life being a skillful means. We have talked about in esoteric Buddhism, which argues that all of reality is a world text, which is itself the body of Vairocana, the cosmic Buddha, which he reads and teaches to himself for his own delight. And therefore each of us is a story in that text being told to Vairocana by Vairocana for his own enjoyment. In that school of Buddhism, the argument is that all of reality is a skillful means by Vairocana. In that tradition, suffering and awakening themselves can be seen as skillful means implemented by Vairocana to teach, enlighten, delight, etc. This is where it's really, really trippy. And this is where you can actually give yourself like a little bit of anxiety, because you look around and you start to see reality around you as like actually not being anything other than a teaching tool. This includes everything from like your thoughts and feelings and your life history and your beliefs, but also very simple things like rock and water and air. Are these things themselves skillful means? And when you start to meditate on that sort of thing, it can really start to trip you out a little bit. But this is what's important and what is central to upaya in the context of the esoteric Buddhist tradition. Another trajectory from which we can trace the use of upaya is as a means of organizing certain teachings and sutras and practices into a hierarchy. One will notice quite easily that the earlier sutras, such as the first sermon, are lists of clearly explained and clearly presented teachings. They're organized, straightforward, and deliberate. The Buddha is explaining his experiences, explaining the foundations of the Dharma, word by word, and there's not really a lot of artful narrative to it. But as we go later and later into some of the sutras, the stories and the imagery and the trajectory of the plot becomes a lot more complicated. The imagery becomes more extreme and hyperbolic and trippy, and the teachings in them become more and more subtle and more refined and perhaps difficult to understand without deep meditation and without a strong foundation in Buddhist doctrine that was established from the lists and matrices of the early tradition. Many Mahayana circles use that fact to argue that their teaching is more refined, more complex, more subtle, and more advanced than the earlier teachings and the Theravada teachings. They believe that the Theravada teachings are closer to the earlier teachings and that the earlier teachings were inferior because the Buddha was teaching to unenlightened people. But by the time that the Mahayana scriptures came around, they believed that there were very spiritually awakened individuals in his flock, and so the teachings he gave were more advanced and complex and skillful than the ones he gave to the earlier people. The earlier people needed discrete instructions and straightforward and dry explanations of things because they had no previous foundation for the teaching, but later Mahayana people had these foundations, and they could be taught by these delightful, artful, complex, and more deeply meaningful methods. So that's why you'll see a lot of these more trippy things happening in the later sutras, and this is one of the sticks that the Mahayana tradition has historically used to beat the Theravada tradition over the head with. The final trajectory that I will bring up here is how in early traditions, upaya strictly regarded the Buddha's skill as a teacher, and then eventually came to fuel a massive Buddhist literary and storytelling tradition. As I mentioned, the earlier sutras are essentially tables or charts and lists, but they're described in words. They're described in prose. This is extremely effective for memorization, for a clear demonstration of relationships, for clear instructions on how to do things like meditate, and for clear moralistic instructions like thou shalt not kill. You'll have to remember that the earlier traditions were mainly being written down from an oral tradition, and this oral tradition relied on these lists and matrices as a memorization tool so that these things could be recited as part of a meditation practice. In that regard, the Buddha's immense skill in upaya was his ability to explain the teaching that way, to explain it clearly and in a way that was easy to remember. Stories, narratives, and performative teaching were not included in this early version of upaya yet, and those things were not directly fueled by Buddhist scripture. However, as we've mentioned, when actions as a skillful means come into it, things get wild fast. The texts that we start to see in Mahayana have more complex plots, they have more extreme imagery, and they have more trippy stuff happen. In certain cases, they even performatively question the doctrine as a means of making a point. That begins to influence a massive tradition of literature in East Asia, which aims to make use of upaya. Literature in East Asia in the pre-modern times, and even sometimes the modern, is making an effort to teach, to enlighten, to demonstrate, and show a teaching through the plot. A lot of these authors often aggrandize themselves as being hidden Buddhas or hidden bodhisattvas, and that's how they justify that their story was reflecting some sort of hidden karmic message that was demonstrating the Dharma to the audience. You'll see these stories that elevate the bodhisattva path, that demonstrate emptiness, that grapple with suffering and ignorance, that question Buddhist morality in a very Buddhist way, and other things like that. These are extremely fun stories to read as a Westerner because we understand and are familiar with themes and tropes as a part of storytelling that are usually Christian-centered or Christian-influenced moralistic messages or characters, but in these, you'll see different types of themes. We are used to themes of recompense for bad deeds, themes of heroes meant to be seen as messianic figures, all those types of things. But when we see the Dharma played out in story form, we'll be seeing a lot of different ways that these tropes are used and a lot of different ways these themes are explained. In fact, more often than not, the hero is karmically bound to suffer in some severe and extreme way, And part of the story is his overcoming of that suffering, or even sometimes his falling victim to it. These stories are very fun, and it's very fun to discuss them in a Buddhist way and try to interpret them in a Buddhist way without reading Buddhism into it too much. And so we'll be reading and discussing many of these types of stories once we've gotten through most of the important sutras that I would like to do. So look forward to that.
We hope you enjoyed this week's episode on upaya. Join us next week where we will discuss Buddhist psychology. What is Buddhist psychology? What are its doctrinal foundations? What has its influence in the West been? We hope to see you there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening. See you next time. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment or review, subscribing, or joining us on social media. Email us at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com or tweet us at brightbuddhism. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.